I'm Haley B. Miller, and this is Ohio Politics Explained, a podcast where you give us 15 minutes and we give you all the news you need to sound smart and impress your friends.
Welcome back to another special episode of Ohio Politics Explained with our guest, retired FBI agent Jeff Williams. In previous episodes, Jeff walked us through the House Bill 6 case, the arrest of Larry Householder, and the corrupting influence of dark money in politics. That interview was such a hit with our listeners, we invited Jeff back to walk us through a couple of other interesting public corruption cases that played out in Ohio many years ago. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
So, Carlton Weddington was a Democrat from Columbus who served in the Ohio House. Can you tell us how he landed on FBI Public Corruption Task Force radar?
Back at that time, the Ohio House was controlled by the Democrats. They were in power, and he was on the Fires Committee, a committee that was responsible for securities and banking regulations. And at the time, there was payday lending legislation that was being debated in the Ohio House. And it was curious at the time because typically districts where like Carlton, Weddington represented, and Sandra Williams from Cleveland, who was the chair of the committee, are very low-income socioeconomic districts where payday lending has been shown to be predatory and not good financial sense for a lot of the residents in those districts. But that legislation was being slow-walked by Sandra Williams and Carlton Weddington. And at that time, that was the main impetus for the case. There were a couple of other things that happened. Jim Siegel, great reporter with the Dispatch, had run a story about how Carlton Weddington had, in essence, shook down an individual that worked for a do-good public policy group that wanted to try to understand why Weddington and Sandra Williams were opposed to payday lending reform. And in Siegel's article, it talks about how Weddington had said that they would only entertain talking to this individual if he would give them $2,500 to the Ohio Legislative Black Caucus.
Yeah, Jim Siegel was a tremendously good reporter. He passed away way too early a few years back. So the FBI set up an elaborate sting operation. Why did that get started and how did it work?
Well, at the time, after these allegations had come in, a lot of the payday lending issues had already run their course by the time we were able to get the information. Now, we had the information, and that was the predication, what we call it, the justification for opening the investigation targeting Weddington. But we needed to figure out what we were going to do. Were we going to go knock on doors, go subpoena records? Were we going to go just interview witnesses? And as we talked about in the Larry Householder investigation, that is not usually fruitful. So the idea was to have an undercover operation where we would introduce undercover agents who were posing as businessmen. And then ultimately, once that initial meeting and then several subsequent meetings went well, there was the undercover agents discussed the type of business that they had or within the type of legislation they were interested in seeing if Carlton Weddington could help them with.
Yeah, so they posed as like wine dealers from California, and they wanted like a small tweak to an Ohio law having to do with shipping directly to consumers, right?
The latter is correct. And actually, some of the undercovers, there were multiple ones in the case, they pretended to be businessmen and investors who had various business interests around the country. And one of the business interests was the winemaking business in Napa Valley. And that specifically led to the ask of the undercovers was a provision that you mentioned, Laura, in the Ohio Revised Code back at the time where you could not ship wine directly from a producer to consumers in Ohio if you were a large winery. There was a prohibition on the annual production that each producer had as to if you could directly ship to consumers in Ohio.
So what kind of trips or cash or freebies did Carlton Weddington take, and what was he willing to do in return?
So there were multiple meetings in Columbus where there were meals at swanky restaurants in Columbus. Weddington never paid for any of those. He asked for campaign contributions. Those campaign contributions that he received, he never put on his campaign finance disclosure reports that you're required to list. He also took 2 trips with his girlfriend. The first trip was to Napa Valley to meet several other undercover agents who were posing as business partners with the folks that had come to Columbus that he met. And then he and his girlfriend also went on a trip to South Beach, Miami. And both of those trips were paid for by the undercover agents posing as businessmen. Everything that they did with Weddington was paid for. So airfare, lodging, meals, ground transportation, anything that they did, the undercover agents picked up the tab for Weddington. And in exchange, specifically down in South Beach, the agents discussed this aspect of the legislation and if it would be something that he would be willing to do and make that change so larger producers of wine would be able to directly ship wine to consumers in Ohio. That's what the undercover agents were pretending is that they represented larger manufacturers of wine in California that wanted to direct ship wine to consumers here in Ohio.
And then once he, received these trips and campaign contributions, et cetera, was he willing to do more? I mean, was he willing to help out in other ways?
He made a comment, numerous comments, but one struck us all particularly, and that was, he said, if this is what you wanted done, I can do this, referring to the legislation regarding changing the production cap on how much wine is produced to allow the larger wineries to directly ship the wine here to consumers in Ohio. He made a comment that, if that's what you want to do, I'll do it. And in fact, if you want me to write a law that says everybody has to wear red on Tuesday in Ohio, I'll do that. If that's what you want, I'll do that. Getting across the point that he would do whatever the businessmen wanted.
What do you have to say to critics who say that, setting up this kind of sting operation and, that it's entrapment, that he got lured into a trap?
Well, we go to great lengths throughout the course of the investigation to avoid that legal claim, because we never want to spend, and we've talked about this both, I think, in prior podcasts on the householder case. So first, at the very, very beginning, before we even initiate investigation, we don't want to spend, I don't want to spend my time, which may end up being months or years on an investigation, if we're really not focusing on somebody who's corrupt and dirty. We want to spend our time addressing the most important issues and the most corrupt people that are impacting the constituents and the people in Ohio. So we don't want to spend our time chasing after someone who may not be corrupt. We want to make sure that we have ample predication. We have multiple sources telling us about whatever illegal activities the subjects are doing. Then specifically, when we get into undercover operations, when we decide on what type of investigation we're going to do, whether it's an overt investigation, whether it's a wiretap, or whether, like in this case, it's a undercover operation, throughout the investigation, we do not offer things of value or money or stick it, as they would say, some would say, in their back pocket. These are all very conscious and open choices that the subject makes. For example, with the trips in particular, we would say, we would like to fly you and your girlfriend out to Napa. We'll cover all the expenses if that's something you want to do. If you don't want to do that, we understand it.
And then the answer is, yes, I would like to do that.
And in fact, the answer in that particular case was an email with, here's my girlfriend's DOB, here's my DOB, so you could buy the plane tickets. So we don't have a big pile of cash sitting on a table and they think they're coming into a conference room for a meeting and then there's the pile of cash that we just shove onto their lap. We make and create scenarios that are very purposeful to give them to have ample opportunity to say no if this is something they don't want to be involved in because it's blatantly illegal.
Now, Carlton Weddington ended up resigning his House seat. I believe he pleaded guilty to bribery. Was that the end of the case?
It was not the end of that case. During the course of looking at the payday loan allegations and the amount of monies that were being given to different legislators, a couple of other things caught our eye. One was a legislator from Dayton by the name of Clayton Luckie, That was the next step where we went in the investigation after Carlton Weddington. And that was because we noticed a $300 campaign contribution from a payday lender that we viewed, because we had the bank records to show and prove that it had occurred. But when we looked at the campaign finance reports for Clayton Luckie, he did not list receiving that money. So there was a discrepancy there. So that caused us to then subpoena the bank records for Clayton Luckie that supported his campaign finance reports.
So Clayton Luckie was accused of diverting $130,000 out of his campaign account for personal use. He's somebody who I covered in the Ohio House for a long time. He was on the Dayton School Board before he became a state lawmaker. Where did he spend all this money on, this $130,000?
He really utilized his campaign finance account, or his committee account, as a personal piggy bank. It was to pay a jet ski, to buy baby toys and clothes, personal effects, a large amount of cash withdrawals.
At casinos, right?
At casinos. There were all sorts of expenditures that came out of that account that, first of all, on their face, appeared to be purely personal. And second of all, none of those expenses were listed on his campaign finance report. So in the bank account, he's taking the money out of the committee's bank account, spending it on these things that appear to be purely personal. And then none of those expenditures are listed on the itemized campaign finance reports he filed with the Ohio Secretary of State's office.
He had a treasurer, right, for his campaign?
Everybody is supposed to have a treasurer. And that was during the course of this investigation, which, by the way, was historical, is what we would call it, totally different than the case against Weddington. So again, Weddington was an undercover operation throughout almost its entirety. And I should say, just to segue back just a minute, we took the Weddington case down shortly after there was a $5,000 cash payment made to Weddington. Now, again, the segue is we're talking about campaign finance. Weddington had asked for more campaign contributions. The undercovers had already previously made campaign contributions. They said they weren't comfortable being on paper and making more contributions that would have to be disclosed. And Weddington and the undercovers agreed to just make the payment in cash in lieu of more checks that would ostensibly have to be listed on your campaign finance report. So to tie back to Luckie, you're supposed to have a treasurer, but when we went to go talk to the treasurer, a fellow by the name of Richmond Jones, it was news to him that he was the treasurer for Clayton Luckie. Clayton Luckie had forged Richmond Jones's name on the campaign finance report forms where he was listed as the treasurer. And in fact, he had no idea that this had happened. And it appeared that Luckie was just self-dealing out of his committee's account all the time. There was no check and balance from a treasurer.
Why wasn't this detected earlier? I mean, this, as I recall, it went on for a couple of years. Is there some sort of a blind spot in campaign finance check and balances that makes it hard to see these kind of scams?
Well, there's two comments I have on that. The first is the Secretary of State's office did do an audit of Clayton Luckie. So I don't recall why, if it was just a random audit or if they had a concern about some of the expenditures that he was making out of his committee's account, but they did do an audit, and they specifically asked for follow-up where he had said he had spent tens of thousands of dollars with a business called the Dayton Printery for yard signs and campaign literature. And folks were talking about how it seemed a little odd that he was spending that much money when he's really in an uncontested district.
That was heavily Democrat.
Heavily Democrat. And the outcome of that audit was there were no ramifications for him, if I recall, because they just asked for proof that those expenditures were real, and Clayton Luckie fabricated invoices. So, and again, when we conducted our overt investigation, we went and interviewed the Dayton Printery. On the campaign finance report, it says that he had made in excess of $40,000 in expenditures to the Dayton Printery. And in the audit by the Secretary of State's office, he produced believe it was 3 invoices. One, for example, was $15,500, detailed all these yard signs and bumper stickers and different campaign literature, said it was paid, had an invoice number, everything.
But these were bogus. These are ones that he made up.
They were ones that he made up. The Dayton printer, when we actually went and interviewed them, produced the real invoices. They had said that Luckie had never spent more than billed more than $10,000. And in fact, like a lot of the vendors we talked to, that he stiffed them for money, that he only paid about half of the bills that were owed to them for the services that they had rendered to his committee.
So Clayton Luckie got charged in state court in Franklin County. Ron O'Brien was the prosecutor at the time, and he ended up going to prison, state prison. Tell us briefly what happened when he got out.
He got out, and not so long thereafter, he was arrested by the FBI again. He got caught up in a subsequent investigation that we had over in the Dayton area that involved public officials in Dayton. It involved demolition contracts, and Luckie was essentially a part of a fraud, claiming minority participation in different business dealings, again, lying and cheating. And for that, he also pled guilty and was convicted and sentenced to prison.
You know, a lot of people who are currently serving in the Ohio House or the Ohio Senate probably don't even remember these names because these guys served, several years ago, more than a decade ago. And in the age of term limits, there's more of a turnover in lawmakers. What's the lesson from these 2 cases for current lawmakers, do you think?
Well, there's a lesson, and I'm going to get to it in just a quick second, but I want to go back. I don't think fully answered one of your questions about how could this be detected, or what was, is there a loophole? And then I kind of had talked about how that the Secretary of State did follow up. But at the end of the day, the system's really built on trust. The system of enforcement is built on trust in the sense that you are relying on the legislator and or the treasurer of the committee's account to say where funds were spent, to truthfully state where and who provided donations, campaign contributions, and then to list those expenditures that were made out of that account. The only way that you can find out if that is wholly accurate is by subpoenaing bank records. And that typically is not done unless you have a criminal investigation where you have the power of the grand jury subpoena and you can compel financial institutions to turn over those bank records.
And they never changed that.
They did not change that, no.
Okay. So what is the lesson for current lawmakers?
Well,
it's still the honor system.
It's still the honor system. I would hope that the lesson, much like with the Larry Householder case, as well as with Carlton, Weddington, and with Clayton Luckie, is that they would be there to do the right thing and to serve the great citizens of the state of Ohio and the constituents that represent them in their districts. But time and time again, I'm proven wrong in that hope that that's what's going to happen. I think the folks at our enforcement agencies throughout the state and my old colleagues at the FBI and the Department of Justice will always have plenty of work to keep them busy. All
right. Well, thanks again for going down memory lane on the Luckie and Weddington cases, and thanks for joining us again on Ohio Politics Explained.
Sure. It's great to be here. Thank you, Laura.